Have you ever faced a moment where the weight of a decision pressed heavily on your heart? Perhaps you knew what was right, yet fear, doubt, or the opinions of others made it hard to take a stand. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who handed Jesus over to be crucified, stood in such a moment. His story, though centuries old, resonates deeply with us today because it is about choices, courage, and the eternal struggle between truth and fear. Pilate's decision to wash his hands, a symbolic act to distance himself from responsibility, reveals a powerful lesson. Neutrality in moments of moral clarity is itself a choice. By avoiding the hard decision, Pilate chose the easier path, one that left a stain no water could remove. His story invites us to examine our own lives. How do we respond when the crowd pushes us one way, but truth pulls us in another? The answer to this question shapes our character, our legacy, and our relationship with God. In this exploration of Pilate's encounter with Jesus, we will uncover profound lessons about moral courage, the cost of compromise, and the sovereignty of God's plan. Pilate's weakness stands in stark contrast to Jesus' strength, a silent king who embraced the cross with humility and purpose. Through this story, you will find encouragement to stand firm in truth, to trust God in moments of uncertainty, and to choose faith over fear, no matter the cost. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, stood at a crossroads that day, unaware that his actions would echo through history. His position was one of immense power, yet it came with a burden heavier than most could bear, the weight of responsibility. Pilate's role demanded that he maintain order, ensure justice, and protect the interests of Rome. But what happens when justice conflicts with public opinion? What happens when truth stands before you and fear blinds your judgment? Pilate found himself caught between the whispers of his conscience and the cries of the crowd. Imagine the scene. A dusty courtyard filled with tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. On one side stood Jesus, silent, calm, and bruised, his presence commanding attention without a word. On the other side, a restless crowd surged with anger, their voices demanding one thing: crucifixion. Pilate, a man of logic and political savvy, could see the injustice. He knew Jesus had committed no crime deserving of death. Still, he wavered under the pressure of a crowd whose emotions were louder than reason. Pilate's dilemma mirrors the struggles we face when forced to make tough decisions. Often we stand between what is right and what is easy, between listening to our inner convictions or yielding to external demands. Pilate faced a decision that would determine the fate of an innocent man, yet fear of rebellion, fear of Caesar, and fear of losing control clouded his ability to act courageously. How often do we let fear dictate our actions instead of standing firm in what we know is right? Responsibility comes with an unseen cost. It's not just about power or authority, it's about accountability for the choices we make. Pilate had the power to free Jesus, yet his reluctance to take a firm stand shows the battle within his heart. How many times do we, too, find ourselves hesitating to stand up for justice because we fear what others will think or say? Pilate's internal struggle is relatable, a reflection of the moments we wrestle with moral clarity and social acceptance. It's easy to criticize Pilate from a distance, but imagine standing in his sandals, the weight of an empire on his shoulders, a crowd at his gates ready to revolt, and an innocent man before him. Pilate likely felt cornered. His decision, however, reveals a hard truth. Responsibility without courage often leads to compromise, and sometimes compromise leaves stains that water cannot wash away. As we explore Pilate's story, we are reminded that life often places us in moments where decisions have lasting consequences. The smallest act, a choice seemingly insignificant at the time, can ripple into something far greater than we anticipate. For Pilate, washing his hands would not absolve him of his responsibility. It became a symbol of indecision, of allowing fear to rule over truth. Pilate's dilemma invites us to reflect on our own choices. Do we let fear, pride, or external pressures dictate our actions? Or do we stand boldly, even when it feels like the world is against us? Let us remember that doing what is right will not always be easy, but it will always be worth it. The crowd roared with a fury that seemed to shake the very walls of Pilate's judgment hall. Their voices blended into a deafening chorus of demands. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate, a seasoned Roman governor accustomed to managing crowds and conflicts, faced a force far greater than he anticipated: the overwhelming power of public pressure. It wasn't just noise, it was the weight of a collective demand pressing against his conscience, making the right choice feel almost impossible. Public opinion is a powerful force. In Pilate's day, a crowd could sway the course of justice, as it did in this moment. Today, we face similar pressures, though they come in different forms. Family expectations, workplace demands, or the unrelenting voices of social media can all create a similar roar, pushing us to compromise our values or silence our convictions. Have you ever felt that pressure? That sense that doing what's right might cost you acceptance, approval, or peace? Pilate stood in that same place, caught between truth and the loud demands of others. Pilate tried to reason with the crowd, offering to release Jesus in line with the Passover tradition, yet the people had already made up their minds. "Give us Barabbas," they cried, choosing a known criminal over the innocent Jesus. How often do we see this in life? Truth, gentleness, and integrity are pushed aside for what is popular, loud, or convenient. Pilate must have felt frustration as he watched reason dissolve into chaos. He saw the innocence in Jesus, yet the crowd's collective rage drowned out the voice of his conscience. When public pressure builds, it often reveals where our true strength lies. Pilate's struggle was not just against the crowd, it was against himself. He feared rebellion, feared Caesar's judgment, and feared losing control. Rather than confronting those fears, he sought to appease the people. This is a battle we face too. Will we give in to the loud voices around us, or will we stand on the quiet, unshakable truth we know within? Courage rarely shouts, it whispers gently, urging us to do what is right no matter the cost. But let us not forget the crowd itself. The same people who welcomed Jesus with palm branches days earlier were now demanding his death. Public opinion is fickle, changing with the tides of emotion and circumstance. It reminds us to root our values not in the shifting sands of popularity, but in the solid ground of truth. Jesus, silent before his accusers, stood firm in his identity and purpose. While Pilate wavered under the weight of the crowd, Jesus remained unshaken. His silence spoke volumes, a stark contrast to the deafening chaos around him. This moment with Pilate and the crowd holds a lesson for all of us. Public pressure can tempt us to betray our deepest beliefs. It can make us doubt what we know to be true. Yet in those moments, we are called to remember Jesus' quiet strength. The truth does not need to shout to be powerful. It simply is. Pilate tried to wash his hands of the decision, but no amount of water could cleanse the stain of yielding to the crowd's demands. What pressures are you facing today? Are there voices urging you to act against your convictions? Take heart, you are not alone. Like Pilate, you stand at a crossroads. Unlike Pilate, you can choose courage, you can choose truth. The roar of the crowd may be loud, but the peace of standing firm in what is right will quiet your heart. Pontius Pilate, a man caught between political survival and his conscience, chose a strikingly symbolic act to distance himself from the decision he made. He washed his hands before the crowd. In the ancient world, hand-washing was not just a physical act of cleanliness. It carried deep spiritual and cultural significance. To the Jews and Romans alike, it symbolized purification, innocence, and the removal of guilt. Pilate's gesture, however, fell short of its intended meaning. Instead of clearing his conscience, it became a timeless symbol of avoidance and moral compromise. The act of hand-washing was common in Jewish tradition. In the Old Testament, priests washed their hands before entering the temple, signifying their purity before God. Exodus 30:19-21. Similarly, Deuteronomy 21:6-7 describes elders washing their hands over the body of an unsolved murder victim, declaring, "Our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done." This ritual symbolized their innocence and the rejection of guilt. Pilate's action echoed these practices, yet there was one crucial difference. He could not escape responsibility. The innocent blood of Jesus still cried out. In our lives, we too may try to wash our hands of difficult situations. Perhaps we avoid responsibility for someone who needs help, or we turn away from a moment that calls us to stand for truth. Like Pilate, we might convince ourselves that by stepping back or saying, "It's not my problem," we can absolve ourselves. But avoidance does not cleanse the soul. Actions, whether taken or avoided, have consequences. Pilate's hands remained clean in appearance, yet his heart carried the weight of his decision. Jesus' silence in the face of this act speaks volumes. While Pilate washed his hands to escape guilt, Jesus prepared to take the burden of humanity's sins upon himself. Pilate's attempt to appear innocent highlights the contrast between human weakness and divine strength. Jesus, though blameless, accepted responsibility for the very sins Pilate sought to deny. This moment calls us to examine our own lives. Are there areas where we, like Pilate, symbolically wash our hands instead of stepping into truth and courage? At this point, Pilate had lost control of the situation. Washing his hands was not a display of power, but of surrender. Surrender to fear, to pressure, and to his own limitations. This is a sobering reminder for us. Symbolic gestures, no matter how noble they appear, cannot replace genuine action. It is not enough to appear innocent. We must act with integrity, choosing courage over convenience. The hand-washing reminds us that responsibility cannot be washed away with water. It must be confronted with truth and conviction. This symbolic act also carries a challenge for us. How often do we cling to symbols instead of substance? Do we seek to appear righteous without truly embracing the responsibilities that faith and integrity demand? Pilate's attempt to absolve himself failed because true innocence requires action, not avoidance. As believers, we are called to step into difficult moments with faith, trusting that God strengthens us to do what is right, even when it costs us. If this message touched your heart, I invite you to reflect and share. Have you ever experienced a moment where you felt tempted to step back, like Pilate did? Share your thoughts in the comments below, or if you'd prefer, simply type the word courage to let us know you are walking this journey of faith with us. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content that inspires and strengthens your spiritual walk. As Pilate sat in his judgment seat, his outward demeanor remained composed, but inwardly a fierce battle raged. His conscience, though faint, whispered to him that Jesus was innocent. Every word Jesus spoke, every silent gaze, cut through Pilate's hardened exterior, exposing the conflict within. Pilate knew the right choice, but his heart wavered, torn between truth and self-preservation. This inner struggle reflects a universal reality, the tension between our convictions and our fears. Pilate's conscience had already been stirred before the crowd even arrived. His wife sent him an urgent message: "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him in a dream." Matthew 27:19. Imagine receiving such a warning, a divine nudge to step back from injustice. Yet even with this confirmation of Jesus' innocence, Pilate hesitated. His struggle mirrors moments we all face, the tension between listening to our hearts or yielding to the pressures around us. How often do we silence our conscience for the sake of convenience? This passage also shows us the gentle persistence of God's voice. God often uses people, circumstances, or even a quiet nudge in our hearts to guide us toward truth. For Pilate, it was his wife's warning and his own observations of Jesus' innocence. Still, he ignored the stirrings of his conscience. Like Pilate, we sometimes resist God's guidance, dismissing it as a passing thought or insignificant feeling. Yet those whispers are often the Spirit's way of leading us toward what is right and true. Pilate's internal struggle exposes a deeper truth. Knowing what is right is not enough. Acting on it is what defines our character. Pilate stood at the edge of courage, but chose compromise. How many times do we feel a similar tension? Perhaps it's standing up for someone when it's unpopular, or speaking truth when silence feels safer. Pilate's hesitation reminds us that ignoring our conscience often leads to regret. Doing what is right may come with challenges, but it leaves our hearts at peace. Jesus' presence must have intensified Pilate's struggle. Unlike anyone Pilate had encountered, Jesus spoke with authority, yet remained humble, serene, even in the face of death. Pilate likely sensed something divine in him, a truth that unsettled his soul. In contrast to Pilate's indecision, Jesus stood firm in his purpose, reflecting the unshakable peace that comes from aligning with God's will. Pilate's wavering reminds us of the cost of indecision. Sometimes choosing to do nothing is itself a choice. In our lives, we too wrestle with moments where our conscience calls us to act. It's easy to rationalize our decisions, to convince ourselves that the consequences are too great or that someone else will step in. Yet God calls us to listen, to lean into those stirrings of truth and act with faith. When we ignore our conscience like Pilate, we may find ourselves burdened by decisions we wish we could take back. Pilate's struggle invites us to ask, what is God whispering to me today? Are there areas in my life where I'm resisting his guidance? Let us pray for the strength to listen, to act, and to trust that his way, though sometimes difficult, leads to peace. Pilate teaches us the danger of ignoring God's voice, but in Jesus we find the courage to follow it. Pontius Pilate held one of the most powerful roles in the region as the Roman governor of Judea. His authority gave him the final say over matters of law and order, and he was expected to uphold justice. Yet on the day he encountered Jesus, his authority was tested, not by a rival army, but by fear. Fear turned his position of power into a seat of compromise, and in doing so, Pilate revealed how easily authority can crumble when it is not rooted in courage and truth. The tension was undeniable. Pilate knew Jesus was innocent. He had interrogated him, searched for evidence, and found no reason to convict him. "I find no guilt in this man," he declared repeatedly, Luke 23:4. By all legal and moral standards, Pilate had the power and obligation to release Jesus. But as the crowd grew louder and the threats of rebellion loomed, fear crept into Pilate's heart. His authority, meant to bring justice, became a tool for appeasement. Fear often distorts the way we use the power and influence God gives us. In our own lives, we may not hold a governor's position, but we have authority in our homes, workplaces, and relationships. How do we respond when doing the right thing comes at a cost? Like Pilate, we may feel the weight of expectations pressing down on us, pushing us to choose peace over principle. Yet true authority comes not from pleasing others, but from standing firmly on what is right. Pilate's fear of losing control was understandable. Judea was a volatile region, and a rebellion could jeopardize his political career and anger Caesar. But Pilate's story reminds us that when fear drives our decisions, we often sacrifice what matters most. His authority became empty because it lacked the moral courage to uphold justice. It's a sobering lesson for us. Power without integrity leads to compromise, and compromise can leave a legacy of regret. Jesus, on the other hand, displayed an entirely different kind of authority, one rooted in truth, humility, and divine purpose. He stood silent before Pilate, unshaken by threats or fear. In that moment, the contrast between their authority was profound. Pilate's power relied on earthly approval, while Jesus' authority came from his identity as the Son of God. This challenges us to reflect. Where do we seek our authority? Is it from others' validation or from aligning ourselves with God's truth? We often think of authority as a position of control, but in God's kingdom, it is a calling to serve with integrity. Pilate failed because he sought to preserve his position rather than honor his responsibility. We too face moments where we must choose between protecting our comfort or acting with courage. When fear tempts us to yield, we can look to Jesus' example and remember that true strength comes from trusting in God's will. Pilate's story compels us to examine our hearts. How do I use the authority God has given me? Do I let fear dictate my choices, or do I rely on faith to guide me? The call to uphold truth may come with opposition, but it also comes with peace, a peace that Pilate never knew because he let fear rule his actions. Let us seek to be leaders in our homes, workplaces, and communities who stand firm in what is right, knowing that God honors those who trust in him. The encounter between Jesus and Pontius Pilate is one of the most striking moments in the Gospels. Pilate, clothed in the robes of Roman authority, sat on the judgment seat. Before him stood Jesus, bruised, battered, and silent, yet radiating a dignity that unsettled the governor. This silent king, unlike any ruler Pilate had ever known, embodied a truth that no earthly power could diminish. His quiet presence became louder than Pilate's authority, a stark reminder that true power lies not in dominance, but in purpose and truth. Pilate was accustomed to interrogations filled with excuses, pleas, and panic. Yet Jesus was different. He did not defend himself against false accusations. He did not beg for mercy or attempt to argue his case. When Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus responded calmly, "You say that I am," Luke 23:3. His answer was neither an affirmation nor a denial. It was a quiet declaration of a deeper eternal truth. Jesus' silence spoke louder than words. It reflected his submission to the Father's plan, a plan that would redeem humanity. This moment between Jesus and Pilate highlights the contrast between earthly power and divine purpose. Pilate's authority came from Rome, yet it was fragile, bound to political pressures and fear. Jesus, on the other hand, carried an unshakable authority rooted in eternal truth. Pilate could not understand this kind of kingship. He asked, almost in confusion, "What is truth?" John 18:38. It's a question that echoes through the ages. In a world where truth often feels subjective, Jesus stood as the embodiment of truth itself. Jesus' silence challenges us. How often do we feel the need to defend ourselves, to prove our worth, or to fight for validation? Jesus shows us that when we are walking in alignment with God's will, we do not need to justify ourselves to others. His silence before Pilate wasn't weakness, it was strength. It was trust in the Father's plan. Sometimes, the most powerful response to opposition is to stand firm, let God fight our battles, and allow our actions to speak for us. Pilate must have felt a strange unease as he looked into Jesus' eyes. Here was a man unlike any other, one who did not tremble before Roman authority or plead for his life. Pilate could see that Jesus was innocent. The truth stood before him, yet his heart wavered. It reminds us that encountering truth demands a response. Pilate tried to dismiss it, to avoid it, but truth does not disappear simply because we choose to ignore it. Like Pilate, we often face moments where we must decide, will we embrace the truth or will we look away? Jesus' presence before Pilate also points us to the heart of the gospel. The silent king willingly chose to endure injustice so that we might be freed from the burden of sin. He stood there not because he lacked power to defend himself, but because he loved us enough to take our place. Pilate thought he was judging Jesus, but in reality, Jesus was offering himself as the sacrifice that would redeem the world. This truth changes everything. It invites us to see beyond our struggles and trust in God's greater plan. When we find ourselves in situations where the truth is difficult or costly, let us remember Jesus before Pilate. His silence was not defeat, it was victory. It was the quiet confidence of one who knew that God's purpose would prevail. In our own lives, may we find the strength to stand in truth, even when the world misunderstands us. For in those moments we reflect the silent King who overcame the world, not with power and might, but with humility, sacrifice, and unshakable truth. Pilate's decision to wash his hands and declare himself innocent of Jesus' blood remains one of the most haunting moments in the gospel narrative. His attempt to remain neutral in a matter of truth and justice ultimately defined his legacy. Neutrality, when faced with moral choices, is never truly neutral. It is a choice in itself. Pilate's reluctance to take a stand turned him into a symbol of compromise, a man remembered not for his power, but for his inability to act with courage. Neutrality often feels like the safest path. For Pilate, the political risks were enormous. Siding with Jesus meant angering the Jewish leaders and risking rebellion, a threat that could destroy his career. By handing Jesus over to be crucified, Pilate thought he could pacify the crowd while absolving himself of guilt. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said, hoping to distance himself from the consequences. Matthew 27:24. But the truth is that Pilate's neutrality was complicity. Washing his hands did not make him clean. How often do we too try to wash our hands of responsibility? Perhaps we stay silent when we should speak up or avoid difficult choices for fear of discomfort. Pilate's story reminds us that avoiding a decision is, in itself, a decision. Neutrality in the face of injustice leaves a mark on our hearts. It allows wrong to prevail and distances us from the truth we are called to uphold. When we look the other way, we miss the opportunity to be vessels of God's justice and love. Pilate's legacy is a sobering reminder that silence and inaction have consequences. Though he sought to shift the blame to the crowd, history remembers him as the man who sentenced Jesus to the cross. He had the power to choose differently, yet he let fear and self-preservation dictate his actions. His name is recited in creeds, not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when we fail to stand for what is right. In contrast, Jesus stood firm in his purpose, embracing his role in God's redemptive plan. Pilate's weakness highlights the strength of Christ's sacrifice. While Pilate sought to escape responsibility, Jesus willingly accepted the weight of the world's sin. This contrast invites us to reflect. When faced with moral choices, will we follow Pilate's example of avoidance, or will we stand with Jesus, embracing truth, even when it costs us? God calls us to live boldly, refusing to remain neutral in the face of injustice or sin. Whether it's defending someone who has been wronged, speaking truth in a world of compromise, or choosing faith over fear, our decisions matter. Neutrality may feel safe in the moment, but it leaves a lasting impact on our hearts, on others, and on our legacy. Pilate tried to escape the consequences of his choice, but his inaction became his defining moment. Let Pilate's story challenge us to act with courage and conviction. When the truth stands before us, may we not look away. When God calls us to speak or act, may we not remain silent. For in those moments, we have the chance to leave a legacy of faith, integrity, and love, a legacy that reflects the heart of Christ. As Pilate wrestled with the decision to crucify Jesus, a profound truth was unfolding, one that reveals the mysterious interplay between human free will and God's divine plan. Pilate's choices, the crowd's demands, and Judas's betrayal were all acts of free will. Yet, through it all, God's sovereign plan of redemption was moving forward. The crucifixion of Jesus was not an accident of history. It was the fulfillment of God's eternal purpose to save humanity. Free will is one of God's greatest gifts to us. He allows us to make choices, even when those choices lead to pain or injustice. Pilate freely chose to hand Jesus over to be crucified. The crowd freely chose to shout for Barabbas. Judas freely chose to betray his master. These decisions were theirs to make, and yet they were woven into a greater plan, one that God had ordained before the foundation of the world. Jesus himself acknowledged this divine plan when he said, "The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed." Luke 22:22. This reveals something profound about God's character. He is sovereign, yet he never forces our will. Even as humanity acted against Jesus, God was working through those choices to accomplish his purpose. The crucifixion, though born out of betrayal, cowardice, and hatred, became the very means of our salvation. This truth is both humbling and comforting. It reminds us that no matter how chaotic life seems, God is still in control. At the same time, free will carries responsibility. Pilate could not blame the crowd for his choice. He alone had the authority to release or condemn Jesus. The same is true for us. God gives us the freedom to choose, but we must live with the consequences of our decisions. When we choose faith, integrity, and love, we align ourselves with God's will. When we choose fear, selfishness, or compromise, we distance ourselves from his plan. Yet even in our failures, God's grace can redeem and restore us. The beauty of God's plan is that it works even through brokenness. Pilate's weakness, the crowd's anger, and Judas's betrayal were all part of the path to the cross. Jesus' death was not the result of human victory, but of divine sacrifice. God took what was meant for evil and turned it into the greatest act of love the world has ever known. This truth brings us hope. No matter how dark or broken our circumstances seem, God is always at work, bringing beauty from ashes. In our own lives, we see the tension between free will and divine sovereignty. We make choices every day, some small and others life-changing. Yet God, in his wisdom and love, weaves our decisions into his perfect plan. Even when we stumble, he is there, ready to guide us back to him. This is the heart of the gospel, that God redeems even our worst moments and uses them for his glory. Pilate's story invites us to reflect on our own choices. Are we using our free will to align with God's purpose, or are we allowing fear and pressure to guide us? The cross reminds us that even when we fail, God's grace is greater. His plan cannot be stopped. Let us choose to trust him, knowing that he is always at work, turning even our mistakes into something beautiful for his kingdom. Pontius Pilate may seem like a distant figure from a story long past, but his actions and struggles hold timeless lessons for us today. Pilate's dilemma, caught between truth and fear, justice and compromise, mirrors the choices we face in our daily lives. Through his story, we learn the consequences of indecision, the danger of seeking approval over truth, and the importance of moral courage when the world pushes us to look the other way. One of the clearest lessons from Pilate is that neutrality is not an option when truth is on the line. Pilate tried to remove himself from the decision to crucify Jesus, declaring, "I am innocent of this man's blood." Matthew 27:24. Yet, his inaction became action. He handed Jesus over to be crucified. This teaches us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Avoiding responsibility does not absolve us of it. In moments of moral decision, we must choose where we stand, because doing nothing often carries consequences of its own. Pilate also teaches us the danger of valuing public approval over integrity. His fear of the crowd's anger and Rome's disapproval clouded his judgment. How often do we find ourselves in similar situations? We know what is right, but we hesitate because we fear rejection, conflict, or loss. Pilate reminds us that seeking to please others at the expense of truth leaves us empty and unsettled. True peace comes not from the approval of people, but from aligning our lives with God's will. Another powerful lesson from Pilate is the importance of listening to God's voice. Pilate received a clear warning through his wife's dream, but he dismissed it. God often speaks to us in quiet ways, through his word, through others, or through the stirrings of our conscience. Like Pilate, we have a choice: to listen and act, or to ignore his guidance. When we dismiss God's voice, we risk walking a path of regret. But when we listen, even when it's hard, we find clarity, strength, and peace. Pilate's encounter with Jesus also highlights the transformative power of truth. Pilate asked, "What is truth?" John 18:38, standing face to face with the one who embodied it. Jesus' presence revealed Pilate's weakness, but it also offered an opportunity for redemption. Pilate chose to look away, but we are invited to respond differently. When we embrace God's truth, no matter how difficult, it transforms us, giving us courage to stand firm and live with integrity. We can also learn from Pilate's legacy. His name is forever tied to one decision, condemning an innocent man. This reminds us that our choices, especially in moments of crisis, leave a mark. What kind of legacy are we building? Are we living in a way that reflects our faith and honors God? Each day, we have the opportunity to choose truth over fear, courage over compromise, and faith over doubt. Pilate's story urges us to live intentionally, making choices that align with God's purpose. Finally, Pilate's story points us to the mercy of Jesus. While Pilate washed his hands of responsibility, Jesus willingly bore the weight of our sins on the cross. Pilate's weakness magnifies Christ's strength, showing us that even when we fail, God's grace is available. No mistake is too great, no compromise too final, that God cannot redeem us. Through Jesus, we are offered forgiveness, restoration, and the chance to stand firmly in truth, no matter the cost. The lessons from Pilate's story are clear. Neutrality is not an option. Truth must guide our decisions, and courage requires trusting in God's plan. Let us learn from his failure and choose to live with boldness, integrity, and faith, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. Pilate's story reaches far beyond the judgment hall of ancient Judea. It is a call to each of us, a challenge to choose courage when faced with difficult decisions. Pilate had the opportunity to release Jesus, to stand for truth, and to act justly, yet he faltered under the weight of fear and external pressure. His failure reminds us that choosing what is right is rarely easy, but it is always worth it. Courage requires faith, conviction, and the willingness to trust God, even when the path is uncertain. In our lives, we often encounter Pilate moments, times when we must decide between what is right and what is easy. Perhaps it's speaking up for someone being treated unfairly, standing firm in our beliefs when others criticize us, or making a choice that aligns with our faith but costs us popularity, comfort, or approval. These moments test our resolve and reveal where our hearts truly stand. Do we let fear silence us, or do we step forward with faith, knowing that God's truth is worth defending? Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act in spite of it. Pilate allowed his fear of the crowd to control his actions. He feared rebellion, Caesar's judgment, and the loss of his position. Yet Jesus, standing silently before him, exemplified true courage, trusting fully in the Father's plan despite the suffering that awaited him. This contrast reminds us that courage comes not from our own strength, but from our faith in God's sovereignty. When we trust him, we can face any challenge with peace and confidence. God calls us to be people of courage and conviction. The world may pressure us to compromise, to remain silent, or to choose what is convenient over what is right. But as followers of Christ, we are called to a higher standard. Proverbs 3:5-6 reminds us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." Choosing what is right may cost us something in the moment, but it draws us closer to God and strengthens our witness to the world. There will always be moments where we face opposition or uncertainty, but those moments are opportunities for faith. Pilate's failure invites us to ask, how will I respond when my courage is tested? Will I allow fear or doubt to sway me, or will I trust in God's truth? True courage is rooted in knowing that we do not stand alone. God walks with us, equipping us with his strength, his wisdom, and his peace. When we lean on him, we find the courage to stand firm, Reflecting on Pilate's story also reminds us of the grace available to us when we fall short. None of us are immune to fear or failure. Like Pilate, we may face moments where we falter, where we look back and wish we had chosen differently, but through Christ, there is always redemption. His sacrifice on the cross covers our failures, offering us a new beginning. God's mercy gives us the strength to try again, to make choices that honor Him, and to live boldly in His truth. As we conclude Pilate's story, let it serve as both a warning and an invitation. A warning against compromise and fear, but also an invitation to live with courage and faith. The world may challenge us, but God's truth remains unshakable. Let us choose what is right, no matter the cost, trusting that when we stand with Him, we are never standing alone. Pontius Pilate's story is a sobering reminder that our choices, especially in moments of moral clarity, leave a lasting mark. His decision to hand Jesus over to be crucified, even as he tried to wash his hands of responsibility, teaches us that neutrality is never truly neutral. When faced with truth, we must respond. Pilate chose fear over faith, compromise over courage, and his legacy stands as a warning to all who struggle to do what is right when the cost feels too high. Yet, in contrast to Pilate's failure, we see the unwavering strength of Jesus, silent, humble, and fully surrendered to the Father's will. The cross, born out of human weakness, became the ultimate symbol of God's love and redemption. It reminds us that no mistake, no hesitation, no failure is beyond His grace. Through Christ, we are offered forgiveness, restoration, and the courage to face life's most difficult decisions with faith. Let Pilate's story challenge us to act boldly, to stand for truth, and to trust that God's plan will always prevail. May we be people of courage, not compromise, choosing faith over fear, no matter how loud the crowd around us becomes. As you reflect on this message, I invite you to open your heart to God's guidance. Trust Him in your decisions, for He promises to walk with you every step of the way. Let us pray. Lord, give me the strength to stand for truth, even when it is hard. Help me to trust You in moments of uncertainty and to act with courage and conviction. Thank You for Your grace, which redeems my mistakes and gives me new beginnings. May my choices honor You and reflect Your love. Amen. If this message spoke to your heart, share it with someone who might need encouragement today. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notifications so you don't miss more content that strengthens your faith and inspires your walk with God.